Because just think about it. And I've been talking to many people about this subject since I seen the video. I seen your guys' podcast, and I was like, I gotta see this video. What is this video? I seen Matt Walsh's video when he was on Dr. Phil, but I was like, what is this documentary? So I scorched the earth to try to find this documentary. So when I'm watching the documentary, one thing that clicked to me is that when I believe is the congressman, the Asian congressman, was he a congressman or was he a governor or he was a congressman?
Let me see. I believe he was a congressman. He's Congressman Mark
Takano.
And he's the first LGBT Asian person in Congress.
Hello, I'm Congressman Mark Takano. Trans Month of Visibility is a time to recognize the strength, diversity, and resiliency of the transgender community. Together, we can make our country and our world a more accepting place by speaking out against transphobia at the source and supporting the trans community by getting the Equality Act signed into law.
Congressman, thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us. You are the first member of Congress who's a member of the LGBT community and also a person of Asian descent. You're also a big proponent of the Equality Act.
Yes.
What is the...
So what he said that stuck out to me is that, you know, we use the 1964 Civil Rights Bill to pass our laws.
What is the Equality Act? If you were to just summarize it very briefly, I know it does a lot.
The most simplest way to talk about the Equality Act is that it simply amends the 1964 Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So public accommodations is one area.
And one thing that as a Black person, what I'm starting to see, and maybe this is the conservative side of me, and I'm not trying to make this seem harsh, but it's like Black people just use that so they can just have civil rights, so they can have equal opportunities because it was based on color, not sexuality. And I believe sexuality is a construct. It's not fact. You could have whatever sexuality you want. You could be fluid in your sexuality because that's what the LGBT community talks about. Fluidity within your sexuality. I can't be fluid within my race, within my skin complexion, within my ancestry. So to be able to use the things that we try to have so we can just have civil liberties in this country, and you're using that so you could be able to insert your own ideologies within American construct, to me is more harmful than white supremacy.
That's an interesting and controversial perspective. But
it's
not
very controversial.
Yeah, but not one I haven't heard before. So okay, so now I'm gonna go into devil's advocate mode because I do want to make sure we have a nice, expansive conversation, and I want to try to give voice to the pushback that I would anticipate coming from those left of center, those who sincerely hold these kind of gender ideology views. You do have I think, well-documented history of Black members of the LGBT community, and there's actually a racial dynamic that I think one would do right to name it, and that is that Black trans people are actually the most susceptible to various forms of violence because of a lot of the let's say generally recognized cultural norms around gender roles in the Black community specifically. And the Black community has been historically particularly vehement in rejecting Black members of the LGBT community, and a lot of violence has been manifested against Black trans people in that kind of cultural milieu. What do you think about that? Do you think that, I mean, well, before I get to the question, like, you have to take that into account if you want to be fair to the view, because to say that there's something antithetical to Black causes or Black civil rights or addressing the systemic issues that negatively impact Black people, the more you embrace the kind of causes, the kind of pro-LGBT causes, it seems to turn a blind eye to the fact that a subset of the LGBT community is Black too. And when it comes to intersectionality, they actually face multiple prongs of discrimination, that those that pertain to Black people, those that pertain to trans people, let's say, or members of, or being a member of the LGBT community, they're uniquely manifesting and amalgamating and negatively impacting these people even more than they would negatively impact white trans people, let's say. And if you understand it that way, I think it's a lot harder to maintain the idea that these things are antithetical, because I think a lot of these people would point out, like, actually what we want to do is we want to take the race issues into account, as well as the issues concerning the LGBTQ identity and the forms of discrimination that pertain to those people, so that we can have systemic change for people. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say to that is that if you of course, that's why I kind of was questioning Matt Walsh going to African tribal close out central land, and why he just didn't go into like a Black neighborhood and ask actual Black people in America what they thought about that, because it probably would have been on the same terms in certain areas as you would in that African country, because again, we're conservative by nature. A lot of us was raised conservative, and you may not think about it, but again, a lot of people who come from the South, are very conservative. If you grew up in a church, a black, especially Black church, conservative. So when you're looking at, the discrimination, I'm not saying be discriminatory against someone because of sexuality. What I'm saying is using that particular bill and not formulating your own bill. When you're using that, you're saying, "Oh, I'm just going to inject myself in that one. I'm just going to inject myself in this one." Why can't you create a bill just for trans people, like the Asian hate bill? You know what I'm saying? So that Asian hate bill did not go on the back of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. It went to their own bill. And I think with a lot of, okay, so what I'm saying is a lot of conservative Blacks, or a lot of people it may not be conservative or liberal, because I'm independent, that's right, kind of right in that middle, of saying, well, okay, why would you I understand using the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, because there's so much that's covered within that. At the same time, there need to be particular bills just for trans people. You know what I mean? That's just for trans, LGBT, gay rights or whatever, just in that particular subset. So when a lot of people are using the talking points from 1964, a lot of Black people, especially like my grandmother, who was born in Yazoo, Mississippi, who came from the South, who had to deal with discrimination, who had to deal with redlining, who had to deal with Jim Crow laws, who had to deal with a lot of discrimination that was superseded. And when I'm not saying that gay people do not go through discrimination. But when you're talking to older Black people who actually had fire hoses put onto them, they couldn't get on buses, they're not facing that type of discrimination. You're still free in this country. You're still free to express yourself. It was not like the Voting Rights Act, where a lot of Black people, especially Black women, could not vote. And if Black men did vote, especially in Mississippi, like where my people were from, you're likely to get shot. You know what I'm saying? Or hung. So I think it's the feelings of Black people who actually struggled through that, are feeling a little bit like, yo, you didn't have to go through all of this, but you're using our struggle for your gain. You see what I mean?
Kind of, but I do want to give some pushback, and part of this is going to be devil's advocate, but part of this I actually agree with, to be fair. So I think that people left of center would say this, but I think they have a point, and that is, you don't think that there were gay Black people that participated in the civil rights movement?
Yeah, and obviously it was. All right, so okay. I'm not gonna turn a blind eye and say that no gay people were a part of the Civil Rights Act, just like I'm not gonna say that no straight people actually supported Stonewall. You know what I'm saying? In gay rights and stuff like that. Especially during the AIDS epidemic, where a lot of gay people were marching for rights and anti-gay rhetoric that was going with the whole AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. That straight people came and say, "Yo, this is bigger than just. This is not a gay thing. This is a human thing." So I'm not saying that. I'm saying equating the two is the problem. You know what I mean? It's just like, and I'm gonna just say it, just like kind of like what Matt Walsh said about, you know, if I want to identify myself as someone who likes to get my limbs cut off, and I think he was talking about somebody who likes to be handicapped or something like that to get a kick out
Body
of it, or
dysmorphia. He was talking about
yeah, you
body
know what I
dysmorphia.
mean? Can you equate the two? So I think that's what the thing that a lot of, that some, I don't want to say a lot, but some have an issue with. That's what my biggest problem with that particular conversation is, equating the two struggles. That was my big thing, because can you really equate the two struggles? You know what I mean? Can you really, you know, and I you know, I'm not trans, I'm not part of the LGBT community, so I don't know, you know, your struggles, but I know damn well nobody's shooting no fire hose at you just because you went to go sit down and have lunch at a diner. I just know that. I just know that.
But this is part of the pushback I started. Now let me flesh it out. So I
Mm-hmm.
do think that it's not quite accurate to partition or parse the two communities, because instead you have both communities that are always going to be amalgamated into black queer people, or black members of the LGBT community, and they go back as far as black people go back, presumably, even during times where it wasn't as common for them to come out and you know, kind of pronounce that they were members of the LGBT community. And in fact, that terminology is fairly recent. Back in the day, if you were gay, you were just gay. People didn't
Okay,
necessarily
straight.
pronounce that. You
Yeah.
just had your proclivities or whatever. You did whatever you did. And so there, we do have, we have an, part of what obfuscates that fact is because there were a whole bunch of social pressures to kind of keep that kind of thing hidden. We actually don't know always
But was
about
it
the
really
prominent figures that were black in throughout history, and a lot of them actually were freedom fighters too.
James Baldwin?
That were
James Baldwin is a
James
prime
Baldwin is one
example. Is
example.
a
Yeah,
prime example of a gay man who fought for black rights.
right.
Because before he was gay, he was black first.
But that's okay. But that's there's an awkwardness there that I'm trying to get you to see, which is that to hold the black identity as in some sense more fundamental to who you are than the gay identity is something that I think a lot of people have to sit in, a lot of black queer people would challenge. They're just as much, like, a lot of them view their conception of themselves is that I'm like, if I'm a gay black man, for example, being gay is no less important or no less foundational to who I am than being black. I'm both. Or being trans, if I'm a black trans person, is no less foundational to who I am as a black trans person than being a black person. So the part of what's implied by what you're saying is that you want to keep these things separate and not merge them together. But what's awkward about that is when you have people who are both at the same time and have just as much pride in both at the same time, and they want to politic with that in mind, then for them it's problematic to try to have to choose one or subordinate one to the other. What they're saying is actually it makes a lot of sense to have bills that amalgamate these things insofar as you're dealing with the intersection of these identities, and you want policies that are devised in such a way as to deal with the unique challenges that people who are at the intersection of these identities face. So you're going to want your policies to amalgamate these in some sense, and it's not a bad thing to do that. What do you say to something like that?
Well, the first thing is that if my sexuality, because I think where a lot of people try to get into the mind frame of this is that if being gay and being proud, okay, you know, do you have the same thing with heterosexuals? Is heterosexual so much of a thing that I'm proud and heterosexual, or that I'm proud and I'm a collector? I'm a collector of you see what I got in the back. You know what I mean? So excuse me, people are going to look at this and be like, well, that's kind of weird. This guy is talking about all of this stuff, and I mean all of these particular type of issues. This man got toys in the back. You know what I mean? So is that the only thing that I am? because the thing is that I don't present myself as like I'm this heterosexual man, because if I did, I'll be called it'd be toxic masculinity, or it'd be all these other subculture words, because I'm so proud of me being a man and me being masculine and me being heterosexual. I will have all these subtitles that have come to me, and it'd be told to me just because I'm being proud of being heterosexual. And it's a totally different thing where you're proud of being gay than you're proud of being heterosexual. So what equates as fairness?
So I'm gonna push back again, and I'm gonna do it politely because I'm not. I mean, I do. So the last pushback I gave you, I actually genuinely believe, and I try to be clear about that, because sometimes when I play devil's advocate, I don't genuinely believe it, but I try to be clear about that. This one again, I genuinely believe, and that's this. I think what you did is roughly analogous to saying, well, what if I was white and I took pride in being white, as if and part of
Something's
why I think
wrong
it's
with that.
analogous is, well, part of why I think it's analogous is, in both cases, I think it turns a blind eye to the relevant history that a lot of the Black pride stuff that we see, a lot of the Black is beautiful, a lot of the Black consciousness, where we present ourselves as awesome, as intelligent, as talented, as even more talented than the white people. Like, a lot of that was a response to the various forms of diabolical treatment that people faced throughout the diaspora at the
Absolutely.
hands of Europeans and white people. So
Absolutely.
if you experience decades, indeed centuries, of being told that to be Black means a certain thing, and all of the things that it means are pejorative, they're negative. To be Black is to be ugly. To be Black is to be broke. To be Black is to be less than human. To be Black is to be a person who's incapable of voting. To be Black is to be a person that can never touch, not even look at a white woman. To be Black is to be the kind of person that can be treated as property, etc. But when you take pride in your Blackness, even though that identity was foisted on you as a response to that, it's like, nah, all the things that you consider ugly, all the things that you consider decrepit, all the things that you consider hideous, we are going to now decide to value, and we're going to put it in your face constantly. That milieu, that cultural milieu, is one of the hallmarks of the civil rights movement. The affirmation of a peoples that have been discriminated against for decades is a hallmark feature, and there's an analogy to be had between that I just described and what in our more contemporary context, what we have is the gay pride movement, because what they're responding to are decades long forms of persecution and discrimination on the basis of their sexuality. Because in our culture, historically, to be gay meant a whole bunch of pejorative things too. To be gay meant that you were wicked. To be gay meant you were going to hell. To be gay meant that you were crazy, literally crazy, right?
I think it was 19. It was up to 19, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not going to say it out of context. But I believe it was 1960s, 1970s, and it was actually in psychological books,
the DSM-5,
that if you were to be gay, it was to be crazy. So
exactly, and they had treatments and stuff like shock therapies they used to do. Was actually kind of messed up. The treatments they used to give them. To be gay meant that you had a certain kind of proclivity towards sexualizing children, that you were more likely to be a pedophile. All of these things were associated negatively and wrongly, I would say, to gay people. And so now, because of these things, to be gay meant to be unholy. Now, because of those things, the gay rights movement is a response and an unlearning and a rejection, a vehement rejection of those negative pejorative associations. And when they say, no, we're going to take pride in the fact that we love who we love, we're not going to be ashamed about it anymore. And and sometimes it gets a little extreme. I would say sometimes it gets extreme with the Black thing that I talked about too, because you got Black people that say stuff that resembles a lot of stuff that white supremacists used to say, but in reverse. And I have a problem with that. You got members of the LGBTQ plus community who are doing things like wearing assless chaps in front of kids, or are doing the more controversial kids drag shows. There's a discussion to be had there about whether that goes too far, but the impetus for it is understandable if you understand the history. So I think there is an analogy though.
And I have an empathy for it. Again, to me, is that again, a lot of pushback that I've had, especially, like I said on Clubhouse, that I didn't choose this life. As far as when people say I was born gay, I didn't choose this. I've had other people tell me that I choose to be gay. I I choose to let people know what I am. You know what I'm saying? I choose to come out, and this is my fluidity. I have no problem with that. The problem that I have, one, equating decades long of trauma and slavery and different things like that to sexuality, and again, I'm empathetic for the people who, because nobody should be harmed. In those two instances, as far as harm being done, I'm empathetic. But I can't equate, I personally, logically, cannot equate the two because you don't have to tell me your sexuality. You don't have to. And when you force me to you now have to tell me that I'm this and I'm that and I'm this and I'm that. I think I have a problem with, because if I tell you to do the same thing, you can look at me like I'm crazy. You can look at me, you can have pushback. If I say no, I'm not 5'9", you gotta tell me I'm 6'8". You have to tell me that. And you're going to look at me like, but you're not. But no, you have to tell me. I don't believe we have the rights to tell anybody anything. We have the right to be respectful, but we don't have the right to push and force anybody to believe and do anything in this country. What is a free country if we're forcing people to do something that I may, not agree with? That's the thing. And I would even say that I have more respect. And if I'm going to equate two things to be true, I would even equate someone who's a bigot, that if they don't like black people, don't force black things on me. I physically cannot go to that person's house, knock on their door, and say, "Hey, love black people. You gotta love me. You have to show me respect." He actually technically doesn't have to do anything. You don't have to touch me. You know what I mean? You don't have to physically put your hands on me, but it's not my right to go down and say, since you're racist, you gotta love me. You in your own set, cool. You know what I mean? You doing your thing, cool. But it's not my right to go and force. And that's what I believe, that a lot of these things are being forced on for me to be able to be like, yeah, you need to just get with the concept, or I could destroy your career. What? That's not fair. That's not fair, because I can't equate the two.
So, okay, a couple things. And again, this pushback is genuine, because I actually do think that there's some problems with the argument that you're giving, but I want to try to accommodate it somewhat. So I would agree that I don't think that we should equate the unique struggle of Black people, particularly, well, throughout the diaspora generally, but particularly in America, to the struggle unique to the LGBTQ community, which is really a collection of communities. It's not.
Yeah,
really
I believe
one
that.
community.
I
agree that we
with
shouldn't equate them.
I agree
But
with that.
the case I'm making to steelman the other side is not that we should equate them, but that we should acknowledge that there are analogies to be had, that there are similarities. They have certain things in common, and those things that they have in common help explain a certain kind of politicking on behalf of trans folk.
Yeah,
That's
I
one.
agree
Number
with
two,
that.
I want to clarify that, because you kept bringing up sexuality, and part of that's appropriate because I evoked the LGBTQ plus, so that's gonna include or entail sexual orientation. But
Yes, it's sexual
eventually
orientation.
we're actually going to get to the trans and non-binary folk, because we're talking about gender with respect to this documentary. This documentary is not really focusing in on sexual orientation per se. So to hone in on that, to be trans is a matter of gender identity and not a matter of sexual proclivity. That's not its defining characteristic. Its defining characteristic is about gender identity. And so all of the issues that you have in terms of sexual orientation are not quite going to be applicable when we're talking about trans and non-binary people, because they're not defined by their sexual proclivities. They're defined by their gender orientation, or excuse me, gender so gender identity, but if we want to be more specific, perhaps we could say by the experience of gender dysphoria, but that's not even clear because you have people who identify as trans or non-binary who are not diagnosable with gender dysphoria for whatever reason. So I'm not sure where gender dysphoria fits in as a defining characteristic, but it's loosely associated with it because there are a significant amount of trans people who experience gender dysphoria. So I wanted to clarify those two things, and on my way to making this point, which is, I do think that there are a lot of similarities, more similarities than I think you've been willing to admit so far. Maybe you're willing to admit them, but you just haven't done so yet, and that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there
And
are a lot of similarities.
I'm probably
But
coming off a little unfair when I say
no. I
that.
mean, we're having a conversation. We're just trying to clarify
Right,
things. You
right.
maybe if
So
we get more specific, you can elucidate. But just
yeah,
to arrive at this, let me finish the sentence. I think that there are more analogies to be had or similarities to be had between these two struggles, which are different and do have very different histories.
mm-hmm,
But the most important one to take into account is going back to a point I made earlier, which is the intersection between the two identities. So if you have a person who is Black and is trans, right,
mm-hmm.
then they're going to have an amalgam of the forms of persecution. And so those instances are where the similarities and analogies are the most pronounced, because the person is to whatever extent that they're different, even the person is experiencing or liable to experience the forms of persecution and
On both
discrimination on
sides
multiple
is what
fronts.
you
And so
saying on both sides.
right.
We're
And so
being black and black and trans.
right. And so then if you're going to have any kind of policy solutions to those forms of discrimination, analogous to policy solutions that we had to forms of discrimination against Black people in the context of civil rights movement, right? You're going to want those policies to take into account the intersection of how those forms of discrimination interact. And that's the critique now, is that like we haven't the civil rights movement did a lot of great things for Black people, but one of the things it didn't do is take into account the intersection of a lot of different forms of discrimination, how they uniquely manifest themselves for certain people, like Black women. So Black people generally got some benefits from the civil rights movement, and among them are Black women, but there's some unique struggles that particularly obtained to Black women that were not really talked about in the context of that movement. And now you have the Black feminist movement that has some critiques about it. Analogously, like we didn't really talk about Black gays in the context of the civil rights movement all that much. And so now you have Black gay people who are like, I got some critiques about how the civil rights movement didn't go far enough, I should say, because it didn't take into account these intersections. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I'm probably gonna get in trouble when I say this. Honestly, at the end of the day, you can say Black women, Black man, Black feminist, Black trans, Black gay. Black is still the front of that. So if you're looking at a house, you're still under the Black house. You're just a subculture of that gay, woman, man, whatever you identify in the subset, you're still Black. So when you look at that 1964 bill, you're a Black person. You're covered under that. You know, now you have people say, well, I didn't get this and I didn't get that. And I think that's where I think I have a lot more pushback with Black. This is just my issue with some Black people that's saying, well, I didn't get enough because I'm a Black woman and we go through this too. Well, aren't you under Black? What is, you know what I mean? Isn't that not covered under you being Black and not just a woman, but you just being Black in particular? Like the voting rights, like the voting rights bill. You know, for a long time, Black women couldn't vote. Then they got the right to vote. You know what I mean? So now you have the right to vote. That's still under that if that 1964 civil rights bill for Black people was covered under that, you're still covered under the headship of that. And I believe if you're trans and if you're Black and trans and you're experience any discrimination, you're still covered on that 1964 bill. You're still covered under that because you're facing discrimination not only because you're trans, but you're Black. So I think I have a hard time trying to figure out, why do we want to put ourselves in subsets? Why aren't we? And I get it. This is what our tribes are. You know what I mean? If we're looking at tribal, you have this one country, but there's many tribes into this. And you said something about, there should be some equation into that. Well, aren't we equated under this being black? I don't understand, and a lot of times when a lot of people are saying, well, I didn't get these rights under 1964, under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But what rights didn't you get? What didn't they cover? Because it seems like everybody is pulling from that bill to get their thing pushed. So I got questions on that.
I think your questions are fair. I think a lot of your questions have answers, though. To be fair, for example, the Crown Act was something that was written, I believe, in 2019, and I actually no longer know the status of that bill. I thought it was passed, but now I'm not sure if it was. But the Crown Act basically instantiates into law legal prohibitions against discriminating against certain types of hair, especially with respect to military service and any kind of federal jobs. Now that's something
I dealt with that.
that impacts Black women far more than it impacts men. It does impact Black men because our hair textures are similar.
I dealt with that. I worked at.
I mean, you see my aesthetic. I gotta.
Yeah,
it's hard to get certain jobs looking like this.
Yeah, I got a sales job where they made me cut my hair after, and then fired me after they made me cut my hair, and then they turned around and fired me anyway.
Right, but do you think that statistically that's more likely to happen to a Black woman or Black women or Black men? That issue.
I because I don't have any type of statistics or anything in front. excuse me, in front of me to be able to equate that. But I believe we just seen a little boy who got cotton put in his hair. I believe that we've seen young Black boys with dreadlocks.
We have
dealt with that in schools.
No, yeah, we definitely have. There was the famous. There was the high school kid that was a wrestler who his hair was too long. It violated some rules, so they had to cut it so he could participate
before the match.
Right. So yeah, it definitely has negatively impacted Black boys and Black men. That's true.
What
I was asking is, who do you think is more likely statistically? I'm asking you to give me a guess.
I mean,
is it going to be Black men that are negatively impacted by those kind of prohibitions against certain types of hair, or Black women?
What I believe is going to be Black women because they outnumber us. That's just what it is.
That's probably partially why, but also because there's a very unique kind of importance that is placed on female appearance and the way that female hair looks in our culture. And so Black women are disproportionately negatively impacted by things like that. And that's not covered by the 1964 Voting Rights Act or the 1965, I believe, Civil Rights Act, and 1967. One of them 67, one of 64. I always get them mixed up. So I apologize if I misremembered what they were. But those things clearly aren't covered in those in any of those forms of legislation. So what I was basically trying to articulate is I was trying to give you illustrative examples of issues that uniquely implicate or negatively impact certain groups, certain subsets of the Black population more than others. So when it comes to the population of Black women, which is a subset of the Black population, right? Things like discrimination against certain types of hair tend to negatively impact women more often or worse generally, statistically, than they negatively impact men, although they do negatively impact men as well. Another issue that uniquely implicates women generally, but Black women, if we're talking about subsets of the Black population, would be the issue of sexual assault. Black women are more prone and experience forms of sexual violence at way higher rates, and it's not even close, than Black men do. Although Black men are sexually assaulted too, and do experience sexual violence too, right? Those are two quick examples of things that uniquely implicate people who lay at certain intersections. And I'm using that terminology because intersectionality is the kind of ideological presuppositions that a lot of people left of center are using to illustrate these ideas. And I think they do have a point, which is, if you're just saying everybody's covered under the Black label, it's not quite accurate because it doesn't take into account the unique manifestations of forms of oppression that that impacts certain subgroups of Black people more so than the rest of the population, because they lay at those intersections of those identities, Black and being a woman, or Black and trans, etc. What do you say to that?
Well, when you use the analogy of sexual assault, I believe I did a podcast last year when we were talking about it was called about hidden truths, where we were talking about assault, especially when it comes to Black men, and a lot more times Black men have been sexually assaulted at a higher rate, but has gone undocumented. Especially if we look at young Black boys who was assaulted um, within their younger period of times, but it wasn't accounted for, or it wasn't the police wasn't involved. Or you start talking about the prison rate of young Black men who are sexually assaulted. They're not covered under any law because of their incarceration. So when there's always going to be, and I was trying to pull up, trying to find some of the information from that story that I had in that, and of course I don't have the information now because I didn't know we were going to go to that particular point, but there's always, and I believe there's always a fair amount on both sides. Just one is not documented as much as the other. Now, when it comes to hair, and you start looking at the corporate set, women have a tendency to be able to change their hair, to go get wigs and stuff like that to put it on. Where in the fact that a man cannot. So you come in with dreads, they want you to cut your hair. You don't have to cut your hair. You can't put on a wig and go to work. Where in the fact the Black woman could, to hide her hair. Should she have to hide her hair? No. Just like I'm saying that anybody who's, non-binary or trans in this particular area, should they have to hide who they are? No, I'm not saying hide who you are. What I'm saying is that is I'm trying to put it in a context where it makes sense. What I'm saying is that when you look at these all of this, there's still we're still getting a fair amount of, even though you might not see it, maybe it might not as documented as much, we're still getting a fair number of lashings. Yours might be highlighted more than mine. Yours might be documented more than mine, but that doesn't equate from that it's not happening to me. Just like how I said I was working at a sales job, and the general manager came in and said, "Hey man, you need to cut your hair." Mind you, 2 weeks after working there, cut my hair on the 3rd week, fired me on the 4th week. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? Just because mine is not documented. Just because mine is not documented does not mean it happened to me. Just because sexual assault has happened to me, it may not be documented, especially when you start talking about Black men who have been assaulted by other Black men, assaulted by men. It's far less documented than it is women who have been assaulted by men or women. You see what I mean? It's far less documented, especially when you go and you start talking about the prison system. You start talking to these men who have been sexually assaulted in their lifetime that led to them to have promiscuous lifestyles, to change their whole mindset. Those are things that have happened. It's just less documented. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. So when you start equating those two, and it's saying it's not under an umbrella, it is. It's just not. It's documented as much.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and there's parts of what you're saying I actually do genuinely agree with. So let me start with that, and then I'm gonna push back again on some stuff. And I'm again, this pushback that I'm gonna do is genuine. This is not just me playing devil's advocate. So the part that I recognize is there are, well, this is implied by what you said. There are a lot of things that uniquely implicate men that are disproportionately negatively impacting men that don't negatively impact women at the same rate. So the prison, the prison example is kind of one of those. Men, in the context of prison, experience a lot more violence than women do. Even if you're going prison population, but also in the general population, men tend to be the ones who negatively get impacted by physical violence in general more than women do. And there's a bunch of examples that I can give that uniquely implicate men. Men tend to, in general, not just black men, but men in general tend to assume the most dangerous jobs, so they're more liable to be hurt at work or get maimed or something like that. Historically, men have been way more likely, disproportionately higher, more likely to be like soldiers and like go off to battle. And so
Yeah.
the negative impacts of that. So we can do that. We can play that game. I'm not trying to deny that there are things that uniquely implicate men, and then subsequently uniquely implicate black men as a subset of the general men population, that women don't experience as much. There are those. You're right about that, right? And there are, and analogously, there are a bunch of things that uniquely implicate women that negatively impact them more than men. You're right about that. So in some sense, part of what you're saying is, well, we have stuff on both sides, and they more or less are a wash. I
It's
think is the
about
point.
I'm looking for equality,
Okay,
and not
but that's the part I want to push back on is if
unless it has to deal particularly with a woman, you know what I mean, with a when it's something that's atomic, yeah, did I say that right? But
anatomically,
anatomically, yes, anatomically that has to deal with a woman, and she's black, like how women were, especially black women, were used to create stem cells research, and they were using particular black women, you know, to be able to do particular type of experiments that they end up developing stem cell research from. When it negatively impacts black women in that particular area, then yes, I believe one is abortion. Abortion, yes. If we should tell black women, you know, I don't believe we should tell black women or women in general not to get abortions or to get aborted. I don't believe in that. I believe that they have the right to be able to choose what they want to do with their body. That's on them. But when we start talking about equality against the board has to deal with women and men, trans and non-trans. It's when it becomes something that feels like, oh, this is just for me, but we can put both in the same category. I think that's where I feel like I have a problem with. Because it feels like, oh, this is just special for me. This is just what we get because I'm this. Well, I'm experiencing the same thing too. Almost like when we're talking about trans. You see what I mean? That's what I'm trying to. When it's like I'm trying to. I can get this because I'm a black woman. I deal with this. Well, I deal with it too. Can we be equal? Can we have it under the same umbrella? No, I just want it particularly for me. But does it cover me? Because I deal with the same thing. My hair was cut too. They made me do this with my hair. Why aren't we covered under the same umbrella as far as equality?
But to your point though, it's actually generally not the case that that black men deal with the same things women deal with, right? So one example that you just gave was in anything pertaining to, you know, birth or, you know, abortion is one such issue. But it doesn't even have to just be abortion. It could just be the issues of complications of pregnancy and how black women are disproportionately higher medically
Medically,
to miscarry and
absolutely.
things like that, right?
As
And
far as
disproportionately likely to not
doctor,
get the health care, the prenatal
medical
care that they
care.
need in order to, yeah,
Yes,
exactly. So,
yes. Now
but
that
that's
I
not something
agree
that you
that.
can say that men deal with the same as women, right? Because that's something that's like really unique to women.
Well,
And
yeah, because that can be well documented.
I'm kind of fudging it because I know that there are people left of center who would take issue with that because they would want to use the terms man and women in a more inclusive way. So I guess to be accommodating to that, because I'm trying to play devil's advocate on their behalf, I would say people with the capacity for pregnancy. I don't like the term, but I'm gonna use it. People with the capacity for pregnancy, which is what I meant. I meant women as a shorthand for that. But
What
apparently
is a
that's not
woman?
inclusive. So people
What
with the
is a woman?
capacity for pregnancy are uniquely implicated when it comes to issues of pregnancy. Obviously, it's almost a tautology.
Well, somebody
Most men are
oh, go
not.
ahead. I'm sorry.
Most men are not subsumed under the category people with the capacity of pregnancy. The vast majority of men are not. That's what I meant to use the term "man" to refer to the subclass of human beings that do not have the capacity for pregnancy.
Well,
Okay.
I believe I believe it was not Stormy Daniels. Lord have mercy, that's Trump's old flame. I can't think of the comedian, but I can't think of the comedian, trans comedian. I think where what I've learned, this is just from